G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here with Australia's Day of National Shame, episode 11. This is a book reading of Darwin 1942, Australia's Darkest Hour by Timothy Hall, and the comment Australia's Day of National Shame was by the Australian Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck. To illustrate it, we have this sketch of a Bofors 20mm anti-aircraft gun, what they used to call an AK gun, which you'll find on page 104 of the 1943 first edition khaki and green. And it was by V32583. We take up the third and final segment of the chapter called The Attack on the Aerodrome, a third of the way down page 79. There was a great deal of panic after the first raid, but it was the second raid, coming so quickly on top of the first, that was the last straw. It had been an hour and a quarter between the first all clear and the second alert, but this had only sensitised many people to another raid. When the second raid was at its height, few of them had ever imagined that they would experience anything so fearful. It was a sensation, of course, that hundreds of thousands of other servicemen have had to experience for the first time, and they have stood fast under the pressure because they were given the leadership they needed. At the RAAF station that day there was no leadership, and the officers and NCOs ran as fast as anyone. The spark that fired this extraordinary and shameful exodus was lit by Station Commander Sturt Griffith. Instead of parading the 1,100 or so men on the payroll and ensuring that they were standing firm and not panicking, he chose to clear the station completely by telling every officer he came across to get to a point, quote, half a mile down the Bachelor Road and half a mile into the bush, unquote. His intention, he kept repeating later, was simply to get them away from the station in case there was another air raid, and to get them to one point where they could be easily fed. If that was his intention, there can be few more ineptly given messages culminating in such disastrous consequences. For almost a week, the RAAF station was effectively open to the Japanese to walk in without a shot being fired in opposition. The stampede to get away and the shame that followed the realisation that they were being branded as cowards would affect many of the men for the rest of the war. As the order that Griffith had given was passed from mouth to mouth, it became exaggerated and embellished at each stage. Some men said that they had been told to go 5 kilometres, others 10, others again 20. Some insisted that they'd simply been told, quote, to go bush, unquote. Another quote, "It was like a fish story," said Flight Lieutenant John Wisher, a First World War veteran who'd stayed on the station. "The more it was told, the longer it got," unquote. The men poured out of the station, some taking all their possessions, some taking nothing but the clothes they stood up in. Few knew where they intended to go beyond putting up as great a distance as possible between themselves and the Japanese they were convinced were landing at any moment. Otherwise, why should their commanding officer have told them to go bush as fast as possible, they asked. In the great race to get away, there were no heroes. Pity Baz Luhrmann never got that message. Officers deserted their men, non-commissioned officers seized the transport, and other ranks managed as best they could. When the flight was well underway, Griffith repeated the message to his adjutant, Squadron Leader Andrew Swan, whom he later tried to blame before the Royal Commission for almost everything that had gone wrong. Swan was totally exonerated, a man twice mentioned in dispatches in the First World War who had often been under fire and distinguished himself, and of whom Sherger said, quote, "He set the highest personal example during and after the raids," unquote. Once the first order had been given, it was like a dam wall bursting. Pilot Officer Garnet Soliu, who was in bed suffering from dengue fever, heard from a flying officer, bracket, who said that he heard it from Swan, close bracket, that everyone was to, quote, "disperse into the bush and go about 1.5 miles down the road into the bush," unquote. The two of them grabbed their steel helmets and haversacks, threw in a few things and walked out onto the road. There they were joined by another officer with dengue named Milburn, and the three of them hobbled off down the road. Solihull and Milburn so weak and sick that they could hardly walk. We assumed the Japs were about to land, Solihull explained later. In the officers' mess, Corporal Edward McLaughlin heard a group of officers tell the staff to pack up and leave and head south as they themselves were doing. The officers left and the men said McLaughlin, quote, "were just like a lot of lost sheep who had no idea what to do," unquote. McLaughlin kept running into normally quite rational people, quote, "who had a great deal of fear," unquote, and who all seemed to have different ideas about where they should be going. Pilot Officer Saxton, the officer who had taken the first message from VID warning of the raid, echoed this. He told the Royal Commission, quote, "the men were sheep, absolute sheep. They didn't know where to go, and this included officers, non-commissioned officers and aircraftsmen. Everybody. There was no distinction between the lot of them," unquote. Saxton, who had had his baptism of fire in the First World War, tried to keep up the morale of the men who were now under fire for the first time. With another returned soldier, he moved between the sandbag positions and the trenches, chatting and handing out smokes. Of the whole affair, he observed unsympathetically, quote, "it was a matter of shame the number of officers, NCOs and airmen who showed unadulterated funk," unquote. He came across one sergeant who was rooted to the spot and who just stood there, quote, "whimpering," unquote, while his men begged him to tell them what they should do. Quote, "The old AIF, Australian Imperial Forces," said Saxton bitterly, Saxton would blush with shame and they would turn in their graves if they knew what had happened at Darwin," unquote. Before long there were airmen strung out all along the way from the station to 14 Mile, 22 kilometres from Darwin. Lieutenant Harold Woodman was driving south on legitimate business when he saw this force of airmen, unquote. He asked a number of them where they were going, and almost all of them echoed the answer of an American had given him earlier, quote, "it's every man for himself now," unquote. The Americans, too, had failed to stand firm and were trying to get away to the south without really having much idea where the south would take them. Major General Blake himself came across a group of airmen slipping away from the station, and he was on the point of stopping them when he saw that they were with a senior NCO. Quote, "I assumed they were acting on orders," he said, unquote, when told that the NCO was heading south as well. Griffith himself did not realise the extent of what was happening until 2 hours after the flight had started. He returned from a visit to ACH to find the station seemingly deserted and was quickly informed that most of his command was heading for the South Australian border. With understandable anxiety at the prospect of having to explain how he had lost 1,100 men, he too set off down the road to the south to try to bring them back. At 7 Mile he came across Swan, still directing the evacuees to the clearing in the bush, which had now somehow moved to 13 Mile, where a catering team was feeding them. Swan said later that he was disappointed that Griffith did not praise him for the efficient way that he had carried out his orders, but the station commander was in no mood for niceties. He ordered Swan to ignore everything that he had told him before and to get everybody back to base that night. It was wishful thinking, Colonel Blimp. Many had acquired vehicles, cars, army trucks, American jeeps, and were now far away down the road. Many got to Bachelor and Adelaide River, 100 kilometres away, and one made it to Melbourne in the remarkable time of 13 days. Others turned up in Adelaide, Sydney, Alice Springs, Brisbane, and numerous other towns and settlements in the Territory. A warrant officer and a flight sergeant from No. 12 Squadron had to be retrieved from Daly Waters, 550 kilometres away. For the next 4 days, Swan spent from dawn till dusk with a posse of NCOs who had not fled, trying to round up the missing troops. They fanned out into the bush on both sides of the road, winkling out an assortment of airmen, from officers to aircraftsmen, who were hiding there. Many more hid in the bush near the aerodrome, coming out furtively at night for food and finally returning when they were driven out by hunger. But the majority of them were openly walking down the road towards the south or camping by the side of the road. For several weeks afterwards, men straggled back to the station or were rounded up in the bush by their officers and NCOs. At the end of the fourth day after the raid, there were still 278 men posted as missing. Most people were relieved to be back. Quote, "We just didn't know what to do," unquote, was the frequent remark made when they were assured that no charges would be laid against anyone for what had happened. Quote, "So we just got out, and then we still didn't know what to do," unquote. On the day after the raid, Sherger spoke to a large number of men of all ranks in a bid to find out just why they had behaved as they did. Most told him frankly that they had taken to the bush because they expected the air raid to be followed by a Japanese landing and they were unarmed. The few who did have arms openly said that they had no idea how to use them and, quote, "We're not going to stay behind to be massacred," unquote. This fear of the Japanese and the knowledge that a Japanese landing would mean almost certain execution ran as an undercurrent in almost everything that occurred at the RAAF station on the 19th. There had been near panic during the first raid when a rumour spread through the base that Japanese paratroops were landing. In fact, the paratroops turned out to be Lieutenant Bert Rice escaping from his P-40 and a Japanese pilot who had bailed out at almost the same moment. It was precisely the kind of emotion that had to be countered at once with firm leadership, positive directions as to what each person had to do in the event of another raid or a landing, and inspiration. Griffith was seemingly unable to offer any of these. His vague and ambiguous order to go, quote, "half a mile into the bush," unquote, might have sparked that kind of exodus at any time, or it might have had no effect at all. In the minds of people who were longing to grab at the smallest straw, it was exactly what they wanted to hear. An opportunity to run away, with their commanding officer's blessing. Mr. Justice Lowe, the Royal Commissioner, said later that he was, quote, "convinced that with competent leadership, the personnel would have resumed their duties," unquote. And Group Captain Sherger also went to great lengths to impress on the Commission his belief that it was the failure of the officers and not of the men that was primarily at fault. Quote, "The attitude of any commanding officer at such a time is crucial," unquote, said Sherger. Quote, "and if he and his officers falter, men will just fall away," unquote. As the individual who gave the order that sparked off the whole fiasco, and as the commanding officer with overall responsibility for everything that happened on the station, Griffith came in for a great deal of bitter criticism. A partner in a Sydney firm of patent attorneys, Sturt de Burgh Griffith, had been commanding officer in Canberra until only 3 weeks before the raid, when he was transferred to Darwin. If he thought there was some injustice in being held accountable for all the shortcomings of a station that he had only just inherited, it in no way excused his failure after the raid to act firmly and with concern for his men. Indeed, Mr. Justice Lowe remarked acidly, quote, "If there was a commanding officer in charge of the station that day who was liable to be erratic when a raid occurred, then it is surely the case that somebody else ought to be in command of the station," unquote. In the purge that followed, Griffith was removed, and with him went almost every officer whose conduct was even suspect of being tainted on the day of the raid, from the area commander, Air Commodore Wilson, down to most of the pilot officers at ACH. Perhaps even more to blame than Griffith or those junior officers who abandoned their men for their own skins was the system itself. The size of the Royal Australian Air Force had swollen so fast, from 5,000 men to more than 20,000 in 2 years, that it was a constant struggle to maintain a supply of specialists and technicians to service the organisation. As a consequence, men were rapidly promoted not on their ability to lead others, which was often non-existent, but on their proficiency as signals officers, intelligence officers, plumbers, electricians or whatever. Quote, "And you can't make a soldier out of a man just because you stick him in a uniform and give him a designation," unquote, said Wing Commander Gerald Packer, the Air Intelligence Chief. Neither the Army nor the Navy were faced with the same problem because their priority was always that a man must be a soldier or a sailor first and a specialist second. Packer's solution, which Sherger supported, was that every new entrant to the service should be given a basic grounding in military discipline. As Griffith had said seriously when pressed to explain what he meant when he said that his men had received military training, quote, "Well, they can march in threes and most of them can slope arms," unquote. Inevitably, the RAAF system, which the Air Board had persisted with in the face of increasing opposition from senior officers who foresaw where the policy might lead, ensured that there was minimal comradeship, little or no esprit de corps for their unit or even their service, and an almost total absence of concern for anyone's welfare but their own. If anyone assumed that the experience of the 19th ensured that future alerts would be handled more responsibly, they were taking too much for granted. The junior officers, or at least those who had returned, were told exactly what their responsibilities were, particularly to their men. Above all, they must ensure that their men were safely out of the building and in the slit trenches before they took cover themselves. 2 days after the raid, Sherger decided to put them to the test and arranged that an alarm would be sounded at ACH. It was his misfortune that he happened to be walking up the steps to ACH when the alarm went, because they came out so fast that he almost fell flat on his face. He had just time to glimpse the front runners and to observe that every one was a junior officer. Furious that his message had been ignored, he strode angrily across to the slit trenches, but they were empty. Only after the all clear had sounded and about 10 more minutes had elapsed did they begin to amble back in ones and twos, having taken shelter not in the carefully positioned slit trenches, but by running across the compound, over a road, up an embankment and 100 metres into the bush. Perhaps Corporal Jim Pearce, who was attached to ACH, expressed it best when the Royal Commissioner asked him to describe the behaviour of the officers on the day of the raid. Quote, "I've no idea," said Pearce. "I never saw one." So, that's the end of the chapter, The Attack on the Airfield. Next, we will move on to The Defenceless Town. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.